Okay, yeah. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, especially Dr. Paul Hedges. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being with us now in this Wednesday forum. It's an honor for us to have you here. I'll introduce Dr. Paul Hedges briefly. He is an associate professor in the Interreligious Relations in Plural Societies Programme. That's in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. So Paul Hedges is not too far from Jogja, but unfortunately well, it's fortunate actually. We can have this, although it's online. And the recent book which he just published, it's titled Religious Hatred, Prejudice, Islamophobia, and Antisemitism in Global Context. That's this year. And another one actually this year too, Understanding Religion, Theories and Methods for Studying Religiously Diverse Societies. So it's been a good year, I think, for you, Paul. You have two books out, and it's only May. I don't know whether you will have another book.
No, not for a few years.
Yeah, but the topic for today will be based on Professor Hedges' earlier book published in 2017, Towards Better Disagreement, Religion and Atheism in Dialogue. And I think this is a very interesting topic to be discussed here, especially in Indonesia, for several reasons, clear reasons. First of all, when we discuss interreligious dialogue, usually in general, people don't think that among the participants are atheists. They are not part of the dialogue partners. So it's interesting to hear about this and why is this important. But secondly, also, I think, important for the context of Indonesia, this way of having conversations about atheism, I think is also important. I mean, we know because of our history, political history in Indonesia, when atheism is brought in conversation, usually that's, well, in a not so constructive tone. Atheism is something, well, the enemy, more or less. Now, probably the situation has changed a little, but stigmatization of atheism or atheists are still there. So to speak about atheism together with religion in a respectful dialogue, I think that's also something new and not less important for our meeting today. So I'll stop my introduction there, and the time is yours, Professor Paul Hedges, and we hope you can deliver your lecture in 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. And during that time, during the lecture time, if you have questions, you can post it in the chat box in Zoom or on YouTube. And then I'll take up the questions later. Thank you very much. Please, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Zain, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And also, of course, to thank Dickie Softjan, your predecessor, for giving us this connection. And of course, if I can thank the other staff at CRCS and ICRS who helped facilitate all of this. Now, as you've said, I've got about 40-45 minutes. I'll try and keep under that, and I've got a script today to try and keep myself on target for sort of not going over time. So if I may begin, I'd like to set out a bit of background to the text which I've been asked to talk to you about, Towards Better Disagreement, Religion and Atheism in Dialogue. I'd not been intending to write a book on the relationship and dialogue between those people who identify with religion and those people who identify with atheism. So I'll say how this came about. But before I get there, just a quick aside, which may be useful. You may have noticed that I've used a rather cumbersome phrasing of people who identify with religion and people who identify with atheism, rather than the simple religious people and atheists. And there's a reason for this, but I'll come back to this in due course. So back to the book. Shortly after I arrived in Singapore, which was back in 2015 to take up my post at NTU, I was approached by Dr. Natalie Watson, who had previously been a commissioning editor at SCM Press, and I'd done 3 books with her there. But she'd moved on to a new job with Jessica Kingsley Publishers, who are a small private press specialising in areas such as mental health, social work and special needs education. But they were seeking to build up their religion profile, particularly focusing on interreligious issues. And while they did some more academic books, Natalie asked me if I could contribute something of a trade book for the sort of educated non-specialist reader. And I'd enjoyed working with Natalie, who's actually a very accomplished theologian in her own right. So I told her I'd think about it. Now, when I went off and thought, for several years, I've been penning odd thoughts about the relationship of religious and atheist traditions, often responding to particular texts, debates, or issues that had arisen in the media. It wasn't the main focus of my academic work, and so I hadn't done anything with them, although I had contemplated perhaps at one time doing a journal article. But in response to Natalie's request, I had a look at these various jottings that I'd done over the years and realised that I'd written somewhere in the region of 30,000 words already, which of course is quite a basis for working on towards a book. So it seemed like quite a good idea to do this. So I put these idle bits of thought together, see what I could produce, and sent a proposal in to Natalie, who forwarded it off to the board of Jessica Kingsley, and they came back with a positive response. And this was essentially the birth of Towards Better Disagreement, which is a title I came up with while trying to make sense of my various writings. And I think it's worth saying something about this title. Now, my earlier writings had been often in response to a group of people who are often known as the New Atheists. And as first envisaged, this was Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Dan Dennett, and Sam Harris. And for several years, even a couple of decades at that point, alongside some other prominent figures, they'd filled at least the Western Anglophone media space and public debate with a ferocious vitriol against religion, positing an eternal battle of superstition and faith against science and reason, and suggesting that religious traditions were the villain responsible for most of the ills of humanity. Now, very consciously, I didn't want to write directly into that space or as a response to them, but these attacks, if you like, provided a background for where I was writing from. And in many ways, while their work was often fantastically good rhetoric, it was often poor in understanding. Indeed, in response to Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, the British Marxist literary critic and scholar Terry Eagleton, himself a well-known atheist, wrote a scathing review, suggesting that much of Dawkins' attack had failed simply because he did not understand his target. And we should note that Dawkins himself even publicly said he did not need to understand or study religion in order to attack it and, as he saw, demolish it. Now, things were not always much better on the religious side. A number of very prominent scholars, some excellent in their own field, had written responses to the New Atheists. And figures such as Professors Alistair McGrath, Keith Ward, and Tina Beattie were examples. But they often betrayed a lack of knowledge of the atheist tradition, or were simply apologetic, without trying to empathise or understand where the other side came from. As such, there was a lot of mudslinging, people talking past each other, and what I might describe as intellectual headbutting going on. But neither side really took the other one seriously on their own grounds, sought for points of agreement, nor tried to sort of find out where the stereotypes came from and how they could be laid to rest, leading to a lot of sort of heat and conflict between the groups. Now, I should say about the time I was writing, I also sensed that there was a more ironic literature coming forth. And since then, so there's been several excellent books that have sort of brought to bring dialogue together. So I don't think I'm doing a unique path in writing this. Moreover, I was not so naive to believe that once everybody understood each other, then they would have agreement, or that some neutral and safe common ground could be found. But rather, as the title suggests, what was needed is that people in the debate could learn to disagree better. And by this, I mean at least several things. First, understanding the other's ideas, arguments, worldviews, and so start to build their critique on a solid ground. Second, be willing to listen first to see where the other was coming from, such that there was empathy and understanding of why quite reasonable people could see the world in very different ways. Third, to admit legitimate criticism that the other had of your own tradition and its ideas. And fourth, agreeing that not everything about the other is completely wrong and abhorrent, and so finding in at least some areas that there could be a certain amount of common ground. Now, on that last point, one argument I made was quite pragmatic, that as far as we can see, religious traditions and atheist traditions will persist in our world for a long time to come. And so it's simply pointless to just shout at each other. Rather, people need to, on many grounds, work together. And the environmental crisis is, of course, one. COVID, of course, has been another, recently in our minds. Now, all of this brings me back to the point that I held in abeyance just now, that why do I use this rather cumbersome terminology of people who identify with religion and people who identify with atheism, rather than simply religious people and atheists? Now, there are several layers to this. First is to overcome a common aspect of the debate, which is that there are groups labelled as religious people who could be contrasted with another group labelled as atheists. Now, this language as a form of in-group and out-group identifier work to demarcate two clearly defined units. And particularly from the new atheist-inspired camp, we might see something like the following in terms of stereotypes. That religious people signifies those with low intelligence, who are anti-science, use reason, so use faith rather than reason, and are superstitious. Meanwhile, atheists signifies high intelligence, pro-science, uses reason rather than faith, and being facts-based. Now, if you operate in such a paradigm, it's very hard to find any agreement or to see any merit in what your opponent has to say. As such, changing our language starts to humanize the people you're debating with. You see a person with their own characteristics rather than simply a type of something to be despised. And let's face it, the vilification goes both ways. So for those identifying with religion, the characteristics would look something like this. The religious people are moral, trustworthy, generous, spirited and good, and are agents of good. Meanwhile, atheists are immoral, untrustworthy, ill-spirited and mean, and the agents of evil. Neither set of stereotypes helps us to see the particular pathways of any person who identifies with either religion or with atheism and their own integrity as a human being. But this is not the only reason. And a second problem lies with our terminology of religion and atheism. To critique that the concept of religion is essentially a product of a modern Western and Protestant imaginary is well known, and has been found in various permutations from Wilfred Cantwell Smith's classic work, The Meaning and End of Religion, back in 1963, up to very recent works of critical religion, which argue we should dispose of the term religion altogether as a scholarly concept. Now, this is not a place to go into those debates, but to signify a religion may include a variety of different traditions and assumptions about what those traditions are. For instance, is Confucianism a religion? Now, I don't know if I can say here, as this is an online talk, but here in Indonesia, where you're hosting this, Confucianism is one of 6 recognized religions. But in the other here, from where I'm talking in Singapore, it would normally be seen as a philosophy or a cultural complex of ideas, and definitely not a religion. Now, much scholarly ink has been spilt on this, with excellent scholarship arguing that Confucianism is a religion, a political philosophy, a form of secular humanism, and depending upon our definition of religion, Buddhism may or may not fit, Christianity may or may not fit, and indeed, one of those so-called new atheists, Sam Harris, is actually a big admirer of Buddhism, while others dismiss it as much as any other religious tradition. Now, we don't need to get bogged down in this, but the point remains, if we can't define the concept religion, which there's a lot of different weight and connotations, then what does it mean to speak about religious people, as if this defined a particular type? Now, if one worked within a certain culturally conditioned set of terms, then of course we can see what the language of religious people might mean. But given the sort of weight that it carries, it's not always perhaps so useful. And of course, this likewise applies to atheism. Now, in some ways, people may say this is an easier term to define, but a simple definition may give a wrong impression. So problematically, if we take it fairly literally, with the A implying a negative and theism implying belief in a deity, then we have atheism, the one who denies a deity. But this is not necessarily what atheism is about, and I'll say more about this as I move on. But for now, as we start to think both globally and through time, we'll see some of these problems with such a definition. How would it apply to a Confucian thinker such as Chunzi, who appeared to have a materialist worldview, and has been very influential through the Confucian tradition, but he's not stopped other people identifying with Confucianism, employing such cosmological concepts as Tien, or heaven, or the Tai Ji, or supreme ultimate, with seeming metaphysical import. Again, if the deity it is posited against is the supreme creator deity of certain traditions, then the Buddha, by his denial of Brahman and Atman in the Indic context, and his concept of anatman, often glossed as non-self, would also be an atheist. But as far as we can make out, he inhabited a worldview where there were various supernatural beings, and the law of karma and a belief in reincarnation were also part of his worldview and that of many other Buddhists. And certainly many contemporary atheists would see this as incompatible with what they see atheism including. So we don't have a simple definition in either case. As such, neither atheism nor religion names a single, clearly identifiable and consistent set of traditions, worldviews, or data. So speaking easily of religions, people, and atheists creates a good number of problems. And for a third point on my use of this terminology of people identifying with religion and people identifying with atheism, and I have 3 points because as academics, we like to have a threefold schemata. It seems more satisfying and complex in that simple sort of 1-2 arrangement. But taking on those 2 previous points and the baggage that goes along with them, if we assume they're a group of religious people, as opposed to the secular, scientific, rational types, what are we to make of figures such as these? Isaac Newton, surely one of the great figures in the rational development of the modern science and a rationalist worldview, but he was a deeply religious figure, greatly interested in the pursuit of alchemy and in detailed studies of the Bible. Again, Taqi al-Din Muhammad ibn Maruf al-Shami as-Azadi was a Muslim astronomer and mathematician working in the Ottoman Empire, whose astronomical observations exceeded those of his European contemporaries like Tycho Brahe, and who combined deep religious faith with a deeply scientific and rational outlook on the world. Or we have the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius, who in the 17th century, like the others, advanced the notion of working as if there were no God, which may sound like a deeply atheist and secular principle. But for the Christian Grotius, it was a pragmatic way of dealing with disputes between Protestant and Catholic rulers and nations in the international sphere of Europe, such that different theological interpretations would not hinder how people work together or stand in the way of peace, Grotius was a deeply pious Christian and a keen scholar of the Bible. So to speak generically of religious people, or even atheists, may suggest that there is a certain type of person who is, for the moment here, religious. But throughout history, and still today, many of the leading scientists, engineers, lawyers, philosophers, and others are deeply committed to various religious stances, and this inspires their work. So it's essentially an analytically meaningless term. It tells us very little about the person so named, much as atheist tells us very little about the person we use that of. And at most, the terms give us a rough grasp on the camps people might identify with, but little more than that. And even this is perhaps a not very accurate marker. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time on this and haven't yet got down to what some might see are the core issues of dispute. But to some extent, I would say this is foundational. It is, if you like, the rectification of terms, or zhengming, in Confucian terms, so I use it in a different context. That is to say, we need to clarify the language we're using before we even start discussing matters. If the words we use lead us astray, then we start looking at those words. The name by which we name the other should be our starting point. Also, I'd say it's a key part of disagreeing better, because to start to see the other outside the boxes we've made for them, and which shapes what we see, what we fail to see, and what we're mistaken in seeing. Without this, everything else is much harder. Now, to go back to the book, I spent a lot of my time in it talking about religion. My rationale for this was that much of the disagreement was basically here. Certainly, the New Atheist critique I was writing in a context of was focused on this. Also, I should say the New Atheist is also itself a problematic term, and if we start to group certain people as New Atheists, then again we fail to see their individuality and particular perspectives. But on my point, both on the part of atheists and those in the religious camp, I suggested that there was more misunderstanding and ignorance about religion than there was about atheism. Now, I was writing and thinking to some extent in the Western context, where the New Atheist critique had developed, and where atheists were a well-known phenomenon, and their books, ideas, and thinking could readily be found. Whereas in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, I would suggest that actually our problem is the opposite. Religion is more or less well-known, but atheism is little known. Often, it is hard to find an atheist, and hard for atheists to speak openly and frankly about their stance. As such, to see, know, or talk to atheists and understand them is the problem. And while some of this work was done in my book, I predominantly focused each chapter around a specific set of issues in religious traditions and how they're understood. So questions of gender prejudice, violence within traditions, and a mythical battle between science and religion through the ages. So here I'd like to take a different tack. And if we ask what issues arise on atheism and how it is misunderstood, I might suggest the following as starting points. So first, is atheism the dismissal of an all-powerful created deity, or something more or less? Are atheists immoral? And is atheism the denial of morality and ethics? Third, do atheists seek to undermine society and lead us to nihilism? Fourth, is atheism only a modern Western and secular worldview? Fifth, are atheists the enemies of religion and all that it stands for? Sixth, do people become atheists because of belief in evolution and science? And seventh, can atheists be involved in interreligious dialogue? Or because this has got the word religious in it, must they be excluded? Now, these 7 questions are not the only ones that could be asked. And of course, there's some overlap between them. And a particular nexus of questions and misunderstanding will vary both geographically and chronologically, but I'll start with these. Now, given the time left, I don't hope to answer all of them in my talk, and in a somewhat roundabout way, I'll try and speak to at least some of them, not just talking about atheism, but also maybe some points of potential dialogue. Now, some years ago, I gave a talk in Oxford alongside a very prominent Christian theologian, and the talk was about the Christian theology of religions, interfaith dialogue, and particularly Christian-Muslim relations. But one of the questions from the floor specifically related to atheism, and while I don't remember the exact question, it involved the way that atheists were seen to be sidelined in such discussions, and whether being an atheist barred you from being amongst a community of dialogue and committed to mutual understanding and social cohesion. My fellow speaker replied first, and I will leave this particular theologian nameless, partly because I don't remember their exact words and so don't want to misrepresent them, but also because their views, as I recall them, represented lots of things I had heard on various occasions. And so they're standing in here for various Christian theological points of view, I think other points of view more widely. Now, this person was very dismissive of atheists, suggesting that there was no valid reason why somebody might leave their religion to become an atheist. And also, having done this, then there was no basis to be moral or ethical if it didn't suit them, as there was no universal ground for moral values for an atheist. Hence, if chosen, morality was simply pragmatic rather than foundational for an atheist. In essence, it seemed that while it was thought that individual atheists could personally be moral or decent citizens, their ideological choice meant that relativism and nihilism was the ultimate outcome of their worldview if taken to its logical and practical conclusions. I was somewhat flabbergasted that a sophisticated and respected academic could stereotype all people identifying with atheism in such monolithic and simplistic ways. So here I'll recount some of what I remember as my reply, but branch off into some other pertinent issues. So I argued that it could be perfectly reasonable, even inherently moral, for somebody to choose to leave their religion to become an atheist. For anybody who has been sexually abused by a priest or other religious leader, and of course we've seen many cases globally related to this, particularly around the Catholic Church, but elsewhere, especially when the hierarchy has closed ranks and blamed the victim or pressured them to silence, then rejecting not only this church and organisation wholesale, but also what it represents, seems to be an understandable and natural decision. Indeed, when we see the corruption in many religious traditions and the abuse based around gender, sexuality, class, race, and other aspects within those institutions, I am not wholly surprised that people feel pushed away from religion and liable to reject it altogether. Of course, institutions and organisations may not represent what may be said to be the better teachings, principles, and values for tradition. As such, rejecting an institution does not entail rejecting a tradition in its entirety. Nevertheless, traditions come to us only as mediated through people, the teachers, the exemplars, and congregants around us. And when these are called into question and are seen to be hypocrites or worse, then suspecting those surrounding beliefs and practices is neither unreasonable nor immoral. Therefore, the pathway from religion to atheism can be undertaken for very good moral reasons. And we see far more morality and principle in many identifying with atheism than we do with many of those identifying with religion. Of course, this presupposes that an atheist is someone who has left religion. And while this used to be the case in the West, and is still common in this part of Asia, it is no longer a global norm. Identification with religious tradition is now a minority stance in many countries, or parts of many countries. And the demographics tell us that globally, not identifying with religion is far more prevalent amongst the younger parts of society. So we increasingly see people brought up within an atheist milieu, or at least one in which religion is not a serious option. When your parents are not religious, when none of your friends are, and when your school system and cultural norms see it as a somewhat outdated worldview, perhaps suitable for declining minority, tied to inherited traditions, then the question arises, why would somebody turn to religion? The American physicist Lawrence Krauss, who has been amongst those taken over from an older generation of, well, let's still call them the new atheists, on the public speaking circuit, has suggested that being an atheist for him is, yes, like many other people, not really a conscious choice. It's not a rejection of religion or deity. It's just that religion is not on the horizon. It's not something many people pay much attention to. Now, in Krauss's case, I take this with a pinch of salt, seeing how invested he is in speaking out against it. But nevertheless, I think the principle still holds. And in places such as the old East Germany, Sweden, New Zealand, or Czechoslovakia, being religious is a marginal life choice, and becoming more so. And so for young people, it's hard to see why it's an option they would consider. Are they bad people for having been born in places where it's not a serious option? Well, some religious polemics may suggest as much, but I'd be very doubtful about this. And when I teach, one resource which I frequently cite to my students is something called the Islamicity Index. It's a scale put together by a group of Muslim legal scholars and thinkers to assess how far any nation ranks in terms of living up to Sharia principles. That is to say, does it implement social welfare for the poor and needy? Is corruption rooted out? Is there justice in society at large? And so on. And interestingly, this Islamicity Index does not look good for most Muslim majority societies. It's conducted on an annual basis, and countries may move up or down, but the top 10 nations have always been secular and liberal democracies, and it's rare for any Muslim majority nation to even break into the top 30. Locally, I believe that Singapore has always outperformed both Malaysia and Indonesia in terms of its Islamicity ranking. Of course, Islamicity is different from implementing Sharia law. It's about living up to the ideal principles of Islam rather than putting the name of Islam, halal, or Sharia on something. Now, how far we think the Islamicity ranking is a good index of the Muslim nature of the country is a moot point. But what it points towards, and as the data could exemplify, is that globally, many countries with the least corruption, lowest crime rates, and most social welfare are not specifically religious countries, but rather generally those which are most secular and often with the highest levels of atheism. It therefore becomes very hard to maintain that atheism leads to immorality and lawlessness and social breakdown. The data simply gives us another story. Indeed, in traditions such as humanism, atheists have developed their own values and principles for ethical living and behaviour. And religion is certainly not the only foundation for this, nor does it provide a bulwark against misbehaviour. Now next, I'd like to move on to the evidential basis upon which people might make a choice between a religious worldview and atheism. Now, depending upon where one lives and how one interprets the world, either sitting within a particular religio-cultural worldview or within a broader secular and materialist worldview may seem self-evident. The proofs could be taken for granted. But I believe we live in a world which is ambiguous on this point. This is not to say that every religious worldview or every secular atheist materialist point of view makes as much sense as any other. Some stances, also it seems to me, are more credible than others. But let's dig back a bit further on this. I'll start with an argument I make in the book, which is that if we go back to the late 18th century or before, at least within Europe, a religious worldview maintaining a created deity held a better hand against those arguing for a godless universe. Today, atheism doesn't fashion like that, nor the traditional Christian or Jewish or Islamic or whatever stance was unassailable. And many intellectuals favoured what is often termed deism. And deists are those who accept a belief in a created deity, but see that deity uninvolved in the world and simply as an Aristotelian prime mover. To explain the complexity of a human or an animal eye, or how we saw different creatures fit in so naturally into their place in the world, seemed to suggest some form of designer. Of course, this couldn't have been doubted, but the skeptic was essentially the one who had to explain the evidence away. And while it may seem very dated, and is hardly the world's best philosophical argument ever, something like William Paley's watchmaker argument held wide sway. Now, Paley was an English clergyman who likened the world to a watch that could be found on a heath while somebody is out walking. And he suggested like a complex system such as this impelled the mind towards a designer. However, while long posited after Charles Darwin, his work, the theory of evolution throws the argument the other way. Alongside archaeological evidence for evolution, there is basically no other show in town. Complex natural systems and the place of various animals, ourselves included, can be explained in an entirely naturalistic way. And with advances since then in areas such as astronomy, geology, and theoretical physics, there is no need to invoke a deity to explain how or why we are here. And while probably an apocryphal story, we can, quite reasonably if we wanted to, with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who when presented with a copy of his scientific book to the Emperor Napoleon, was queried as to why God was not found within the pages, replied with this simple quip, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Now, an explanation of something is not a disproof itself, but any credible theistic worldview, or so it seems to me, at least of the type so common amongst the three main Abrahamic traditions, needs to explain how and where evolution fit into God's plan for creation. In other words, the burden of proof now resides on the other side. Of course, there is also much in the universe that points towards some form of religious or spiritual explanation or hypothesis, and a stark materialism which suggests that all that exists can be explained by strictly deterministic laws is far from given. And certainly, the presumption that scientific education leads towards atheism is far from proven. The best evidence we have from studies is that people who go to university to study the hard sciences have very little change in their religious belief based upon this study. And while in the USA, most scientists tend towards atheism, in Hong Kong, scientists tend to be more religious than the general population. It seems to be forms of socialization rather than scientific education that leads people to adopt or reject either an atheistic or religious worldview. Moving on, and ask what we mean by dialogue. While my publishers decided that a suitable subtitle for my book was Religion and Atheism in Dialogue, it is of course the case that religion and atheism cannot be in dialogue. Systems of thought cannot dialogue, only people can. As such, we do not see religion and atheism in dialogue, whatsoever those two terms may mean anyway, but rather only specific people with their own specific ways of living out and understanding what identification with either religion or atheism may mean. Dialogue, then, is always the meeting of individuals with their own worldviews, and any interreligious dialogue is not a dialogue of religions, but a dialogue of people with particular forms of identification. And partly for this reason, I have suggested that we might want to use the term inter-worldview dialogue rather than interreligious dialogue. Now, inter-worldview may be cumbersome, and it is certainly not a perfect term in many ways, but it stresses the point that we do not see clearly demarcated borders between those things we label as religions and those things we label as atheisms. And of course, when we speak about interreligious dialogue, we can be speaking about a huge range of activities, varying from social work inspired by people's worldviews, to discussing ethical issues, to sharing forms of mindfulness, prayer, and meditation. And there's nothing inherent in any of this that restricts identification with atheism from inclusion within it. Now, finally, and so definitely not covering all the points that I've noted here that we could discuss, I'd like to talk about two concepts that seem pertinent: Islamophobia and atheophobia. On the atheist side, it seems clear that not all religion is equally bad. Because of various Orientalist stereotypes, Hinduism and Buddhism are often presented in the West as peaceful, even pacifist traditions, not bogged down in the violences beset the Abrahamic traditions. And often Buddhism is especially favoured, and in the 18th century, both the Buddha and Confucius were seen as examples of thinkers who had promulgated an ethical system that matched Christianity, without any need of revelation or divine lawgiver. But be this as it may, it's the other side I'd like to emphasise, because in recent atheist polemic, not only are they good, or at least better religions, there are also worse religions. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the bad ones, particularly amongst the new atheist polemic. And of these, the youngest, Islam, is that most picked out for opprobrium. Now, this singling out of Islam as distinct does not arise out of nowhere, and it certainly doesn't arise out of an atheist milieu itself. Rather, for at least 1,000 years, what we've come to know as Europe has, over the course of time, positioned itself against a political threat to its borders which has come from a primarily Muslim majority empires. And therefore we've had an image of the savage Muslim intent on destroying the Christian Europe. And this today haunts both its religious and secular imaginaries. Overcoming Islamophobia, therefore, seems in many places a key part of dialogue that seeks to bring together those identifying with religion and atheism. And indeed, Islamophobia, also forged in Europe, has become globalized with colonialism and its aftermath. Yet, contrarily, in various religious imaginaries over recent decades or further back, the atheist has haunted the mind, especially of Christians and Muslims. In each case, the Islamophobia or atheophobia is fueled by stereotypes, ignorance, and a sense of an us versus them social identification that relates to threat perception and imagined enemies. The actual lives and beliefs and practices of individual atheists get very little look in this process. Indeed, as with much prejudice, it often is its most prevalent where the vilified other is least known. Now, I've already made comments about how atheists are viewed by some identifying with religious camp, so I don't think there's any need to repeat it. But hopefully I've made a case that an atheist identity does not entail immorality or nihilism. Neither are they inherently hostile to everything we would identify with religion. Now, this brings me back in many ways to where I started this lecture, where I noted that we have these simple views of what an atheist may be or what a religious person may be. So often, of course, the Muslim carries extra baggage beyond this. But it's a key point, I think, in terms of where you must begin if you want to engage in dialogue. Who exactly is the other in themselves? And what is the particular nature of that individual in their own integrity? Of course, the wider question about shared worldviews and commitments is important, and these must go together. A stereotype of the worldview of another may prevent us from seeing them in their own unique personhood, while it is often through particular people that we come to understand the worldview or ideological stance and concomitant practices with which they identify. Indeed, we see this happen perhaps when religious people and atheists do come together in dialogue. And this final picture is of the launch of my book towards Better Disagreement, Religion and Atheism Dialogue, and that's some members of the Humanist Society in Singapore, with myself and Imran Taib, who are also speakers there. And just to note on to date, Zainul Baghi was absolutely correct when he said this book came out in 2017. So you might wonder how this book is entitled 2016. It's because publishers, if any book is coming out in the last quarter of a year, they put its date in the next year. So inside the book, it is 2017 for its official publication date, but we actually got copies in 2016. Now, all of this leads me to conclude this talk, and I hope I've opened up some questions in your minds. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul, for a very interesting presentation. And now we have time for questions and answers. If any of you have a question, you can write it down in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hands, not your real hands. I mean, if it's virtual hand, I can easily see it. Well, before, I haven't seen anything on the chat yet. But I'd like, there's one point which I'd like to follow up for you, from you, and also briefly summarize it. Some of the important points. First of all, you started your presentation by looking at the stereotypes which religious people have of atheists and vice versa. This is an obstacle to dialogue, but this is the more reason to have dialogue because of these stereotypes. Now, well, one of the things which came to my mind when you speak about dialogue here, mostly this means discursive dialogue, assuming that the differences between these different parties, there are well, differences in terms of beliefs. But I think it's more than that. The fact that there is, I mean, in the end, you speak about Islamophobia, atheophobia, etc. There are more than this. So I was wondering if you mean certain thing with dialogue, or whether I'm correct in saying that the assumption about that the differences between the two are in terms of beliefs. Please, Paul.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Zain, for that question. Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I said these stereotypes, I said, they're the obstacle, but also the reason to dialogue. So very much on course there. Yes, I mean, interreligious dialogue, yeah, when we use that word, we often, I said, do think about, as you said, this discursive sort of form of dialogue, this discussion around beliefs. But of course, it's not the only form of dialogue that takes place. And I mentioned this sort of briefly during my talk. And of course, a lot of dialogue that does sort of take place is often called dialogue of action, where if you like, sort of communities will come together for sort of common concerns. And this may be around things like sort of social welfare, it may be sort of disaster relief. You know, it leads people, like people's worldviews lead them into action in various ways. And this is actually a really good way to help break down stereotypes between groups. So if it's sort of something that sort of atheists get involved in as well, and of course, you know, I mean, it could be sort of after sort of natural disasters, it could be poverty relief, it could be around sort of ecological, environmental sort of issues. When people come together to work for common cause, and it becomes dialogue, if like, because of this, they talk about their sort of rationale for this. So if like, you know, the Christian or the Buddhist or the Muslim or Sikh or whoever can say, you know, I've come in, I want to work to help the environment because, you know, in my tradition, X, Y, and Z. If, of course, you also have like the atheists and humanists there and say, well, you know, from a particularly humanist sort of point of view, we want to sort of improve the human world. We want all humans to flourish. And that sort of brings us into this. Then it is, of course, sort of discursive at that stage, but people working alongside each other, seeing the common good, which is done, it's almost like more powerful. It's like, you know, words, there's the old sort of saying, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. An action is almost worth, if you like, 1,000 pictures. So that common action is a really good way to break down these stereotypes and build sort of bonds of understanding between people. But of course, I said discursive dialogue, again, yes, atheists can be included in this. They have a worldview, they have ideologies behind sort of what they do. And so all of that can sort of be brought in to discuss. And again, there's often perhaps quite simplistic ideas on each side as to what the other thinks. So to sort of get a sort of a more complex idea, which is, I say, like, it's not always to agree, but at least if you understand it better, you understand the disagreements better. And of course, that may help you to sharpen a critique of the other, or it may lead you into appreciation as well of sort of some differences behind that other person and where they come from.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Again, if there's any question, you can, okay, well, I find one question here on the chat from Pak Haryadi. Well, Pak Haryadi, if you want to give a voice to the questions, I mean, if you want to speak it out, that's fine. You can open your microphone, but otherwise I'll read the question. So the question is, some of the highly religious people believe that their faith is the ultimate truth and they have a missionary tendency. Do you think it can be an obstacle for a dialogue between them and atheists? This is from Haryadi from Jenderal Sudirman University.
Okay, thank you very much, Haryadi. That's an excellent question, but I'd like to start off by basically breaking down part of what you say, which is about the very religious people. And I don't think, if you like, you get very religious people who want to spread their faith and then less religious people who are involved in dialogue. Dialogue is often traced back all the way to 1893 as a particular sort of movement in the modern world. And it's become the key part of what many religious institutions do. And perhaps it's easy to talk about sort of the Catholic Church because it's got a institutional sort of organization. So it's clear to see sort of how this works globally. Since what is called the Second Vatican Council, sort of 1962 to 1965, the Catholic Church has said that sort of dialogue is a process that it does with its own integrity. There is a department within the Vatican specifically set up to do interreligious dialogue, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, with a cardinal at its head. Now, being a cardinal in the Catholic Church, you're clearly a very religious person, as is the Pope. The Pope does interreligious dialogue, the cardinal does interreligious dialogue, and all extremely religious Catholics are fully open to engaging in dialogue with other people. Of course, this doesn't stop them from doing mission, and often they will understand sort of mission not if like it's trying to force people to understand their point of view, but in living a good life. And if people see their good life and then sort of get inspired by that, then they can come to them. It's not about trying to force other people to see your point of view. So if you like, yes, there are some, if you like, sort of hardline people who only want to sort of do conversion as opposed to dialogue, but it's not really, I said, representative of people who are more religious than many others. And some of these groups, I often wonder, perhaps they have some doubt about their own religiosity, and that's why they sort of have to be so forceful about sort of where they're coming from within this. But yes, certainly sort of hardline groups who are opposed to dialogue do exist. There are ways to engage them, and something that's been tried very prominent sort of in some places, it's called Scriptural Reasoning. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a tradition that often brings in perhaps more traditional conservative people who wouldn't come to a thing that was normally labelled interreligious dialogue. But because people are coming to discuss their own texts in a specifically sort of religious context, Scriptural Reason, I said, often sort of brings in these more, not always sort of the most sort of hardline, but very sort of traditional sort of conservative people who might sort of be opposed to interreligious dialogue on other platforms into this discussion. So yes, there are hardliners who can be averse, but it doesn't stop dialogue. And I said being very religious also leads people into dialogue in various ways.
Okay, thank you. Well, there's question, one hand raised from Jaco. Jaco is a student at ICRS. Please, Jaco, if you can open your mic and camera as well, better. Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Paul. I have questions, but maybe the example not really related with you, but I'm curious to know your opinion. Actually, I'm quite confused about the difference between atheist and agnostic regarding the interreligious dialogue. In Indonesia, we have one YouTube channel founded by some prominent theologian, Christian theologian in Indonesia, and some students of theology and religious studies who are now studied abroad. And this channel usually hosted discussion about even Christian theology or also interreligious studies. But from many episodes, from many discussions that hosted by this channel, I think the most viewed discussion is the discussion with one agnostic man from Indonesia named Choki Pardede.
Mm.
This person claimed himself as agnostic, and he also said that I'm disappointed with religious institution because he comes from a Christian family. But he one of the discussion they hosted like 1 month ago, for example, the title is "I'm Going to Hell in Every Religion." So the discussion like this, in which Choki Pardede, for example, criticize Christianity, get many attention. If the other discussion about Christian dogma or maybe another issue in Christianity only viewed by hundreds of viewers, but the discussion with Choki Pardede viewed by almost 10,000 viewers. So I mean, even it is difficult to you to relate with my example, but I mean, is it agnostic people easier to do a discussion, interreligious discussion, or actually people need to people also enjoy to criticize their religion? I mean, like the interreligious dialogue actually can study from intra-religious. I mean, like people like to discuss their religion, the witness, or even the stories from the Bible. Choki Pardede make fun of it, and we can laugh of the story. Even the participant of the discussion, some of them also Christian priests. So I mean, like maybe people enjoy to discuss about religion in funny way, in such relaxing way, not too serious, but they love to discuss, they love to even make fun, but they also see that religion is not always serious, something like that. But maybe you get difficult with my question, but I'm curious to know your opinion about this.
Okay, thank you very much, Jekko. There's a lot of stuff you've put into that question, so I'll try and sort of answer some of the different parts of it. Firstly, yes, the atheism, agnostic, I'd also sort of say theistic sort of part, they're not always completely distinct. If you like, sort of the term atheism, as I mentioned in my talk, the way it's sort of set up linguistically, it is sort of this denial of theism, it's a denial of a god. So that's sort of one camp. The agnostic, I mean, literally is just a person who doesn't know, is uncertain. Now, of course, between, if you like, maybe the most extreme atheist, the most extreme sort of belief in a deity, there's a lot of sort of grey area in between. And actually sort of Richard Dawkins himself at one point said that actually, you know, of course, I don't absolutely know that there is no God. It's possible that I'm wrong. So also I call myself an atheist. I mean, technically, I'm just like, you know, if there was like a scale of 1 to 10, I'm like on the, you know, where 0 is the least atheist, 10 is the most atheist, I'm like a 9.9. I'm actually like a really, really skeptical agnostic. And I think that a lot of religious people as well, again, sort of talking here like from a theistic sort of background, also, of course, have their doubts. I mean, going back, I said, if we're talking particularly about the Abrahamic sort of traditions, I mean, the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible is a key part of this, where Job, of course, sort of has his doubts, like sort of, you know, was around sort of questions of evil, but can there be a God? Is it there? And if like it's always been a part of like the Jewish tradition that you're allowed to sort of question and talk back. So, you know, I think there are very few religious people who've never had doubts, have absolute certainty. And even the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Professor Owen Williams, you know, he once said, you know, of course, I don't absolutely know that there is a God. Sometimes I have doubts. Sometimes I find it very hard to believe there's a God when I see great evil in the world. So I myself have doubts as well. So, I wouldn't say that there's atheists in one camp, agnostics in another, then theistic people. To some extent, we're all sort of forms of agnostic. As long as we're being reasonable. I mean, if you get people who say, I've got absolutely no doubt at all, I'd be very worried about them. They're probably lying or something else going on. They just can't admit to that doubt, which I said is actually a part of traditions themselves. Of course, again, within the Christian tradition, there's, you may know sort of doubting Thomas. He's one of the disciples, the apostles. He's a saint in the Christian tradition, but of course, he doubts Jesus's sort of resurrection when he first hears about it. So, like, this possibility for doubt, particularly for having more in Judaism than either sort of Christianity or Islam, but in Judaism particularly, this area for doubt is really strongly there. So, having sort of said that, I mean, yeah, I'm very pleased in a sense that this sort of question has had so much interest cited around it from this sort of agnostic person. But also, again, of course, I said, when we start to talk about this, of course, it's much more complicated. And I've mentioned sort of Buddhism already. So I said, in a sense, of course, Buddhism also denies a created deity. So are Buddhists atheists? Are they in the agnostic camp somewhere? They aren't theists if we mean theism by believing in a created deity, because they don't sit in that. So, again, it's not just like we've got this sort of continuum, this straight line, like the most atheist to the most theistic. There's all sorts of other poles coming off from this. It's a much more complex situation. Now, of course, with agnostics, you say, is it easier to talk with them? And again, all of this, I mean, through the talk, I've been talking about, people's particular sort of worldviews, where they come from. Individuals are always different. Having an interreligious dialogue with somebody like Richard Dawkins or the late Christopher Hitchens, very, very difficult. I mean, they are, if you like, very hardline people in that point of view. But of course, not all atheists are like that. I mean, of course, as the last picture I showed, we had the Singapore Humanist Organization talking to myself and sort of others there within this. So you get atheists who are quite happy to sort of engage in interreligious dialogue. And also, certainly, I know here in Singapore, there have been quite a lot of occasions where atheists and religious people have come together. This has happened in NUS, the National University of Singapore, amongst the student organisation, where they actually have an interreligious organisation as well as the particular religious organisations, and a humanist organisation has been brought in as part of these discussions, so that there's no problem at all. And again, of course, with an agnostic, yes, some agnostics are maybe seeking, they have questions. Some agnostics maybe just, I don't really care, I'm not interested in that question. And of course, then you can't really engage them in dialogue if they don't have the interest in really sort of pursuing this. I don't know if you can hear the thunder in the background. I may have upset some local deity here with that comment. So I said there's always sort of another sort of factor to this. Of course, another factor to come in, and just to sort of throw a bit more terminology in there, you may have heard the term the nuns. And this is not sort of nuns as in Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, what are often called the religious nuns. And these are the people like on census data, when you've got like your Christian, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, they tick none of the above. And this is a growing phenomenon. I'm not sure, I think in Indonesia, everyone technically has to belong to a religion, so you probably don't have so many there. But across much of the Western world, in Singapore, it's a growing proportion. 17 or 18% of the population now in Singapore is a nun. But they're not necessarily irreligious, if you like. They don't give up on religion. They just don't want to belong to a particular tradition. Now, some of them may attend the temples or services of several different religions. Some are, again, what we're more spiritual but not religious. They fit into that sort of dynamic. So there's lots of different stuff coming into this. So, I mean, I hope I've spoken a bit to that thing. The other thing about sort of the humour question. Yes, I mean, humour can be a really powerful tool to help with some of these discussions. The problem, of course, it's quite a dangerous tool because people don't always get the joke. And so you really sort of need to know the other person very well. And again, this is part of what dialogue does. You know, dialogue is, at one level, it's basically about friendship, getting a certain sort of trust and empathy with another human being. And once sort of that's built up, you know, yes, you can sort of go into sort of a level of humour, which you might not with other people. And of course, with some people, you know, these things you never joke about. I remember when I was at university, talking to a friend. I often used to attend our university chapel. We had a chapel there, and I was talking to a friend about sort of, you know, some humorous things that have been going on. And he was absolutely shocked. Now, this friend, he never came to chapel, he never went to any church, but he kind of saw himself as like religious somehow. And he was shocked as, how on earth can you joke about these things? These are so important. And it's like, okay, you're the person who never goes to any service, but you're offended by us who go, basically, you know, sort of finding another way to express and talk about this. So again, it's, I don't want to say everything is individual, but this is not something that is very, very individual. And again, there's certain people I would sort of open up, if you like, in humorous ways with all the joke, and other people I wouldn't necessarily do that with. Particularly online, it's very, very dangerous online. There's again something that, like in face-to-face, you know, you can see people's facial expressions, you can tell they're joking, but like if it's just comments on like Facebook or some chat forum, you know, there's no context there, so it's very, very dangerous to joke online in particular. I've discovered this. I've offended many people by saying something I thought was humorous. I'm not about religion, I'm just generally. And basically, you know, because they're sitting there, you know, the other side of the world, they just had a bad day and they read this thing and, oh my God, why did you say that? And it's like, okay, I was joking. Don't take it so seriously. So yeah, I would always be very careful about sort of the humorous side of this. I hope that answers, I said, your various questions. I said you seem to have quite a few questions in your comment.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. There's another hand raised, Mas Abdullah Muslih, well, a long name. Yeah,
thank you,
please.
General.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for this beautiful occasion. And Paul Hedges, it's very nice to see you again. And okay, thank you. And I have actually two questions for you. The first is regarding the secular worldviews that you have mentioned earlier. Actually, I have read a statement came from Nanyang Smart that by regards to the study of religions, we have to take a look at both religious and secular worldviews. But in addition to this statement, as well as following your earlier explanation, excuse me, wait. Okay, sorry, my daughter is playing. My question is how these two diverged worldviews which came from different backgrounds. They have a very different theological foundations, can engage in let's say a similar platform, then do a dialogue. It quite confused me as okay, in the sense of an interreligious dialogue, I can't quite imagine it, but in regards to the real implementation between religious and atheist dialogue, I don't know exactly how these two different worldviews can meet in some place. Okay, and second question is, according to you, Paul, what is the most crucial issues in the term of interfaith dialogues in this in the context of Southeast Asia? Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Yes, please, Paul.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Abdullah, shall I call you Abdullah? For those two questions.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. First, the secular worldviews. I mean, very pleased to hear you mention another British scholar here, Nanyang Smart. I once heard him talk many, many years ago. He was a wonderful speaker, very humorous. Okay. This is going to be very hard to answer unless I go into perhaps a 1-hour lecture first on what the secular might mean. It's one of these incredibly misunderstood terms. And if I may just quickly do another bit of advertising here. At the beginning, Zane mentioned one of my books, Understanding Religion. Chapter 16 is all about secularism and the complex problem of that. Yeah, absolutely, yes. Now, religion and secular, as terms, they make no sense without the other one. Because, if you like, from around about 17th, 18th century, the northwestern European world starts to sort of split itself into sort of two camps, if you like, this privatized area of like sort of morality and the home and religion, and if you like this public sphere of sort of politics, science, economics, all this other stuff which comes on under the secular. And so it makes a division that no human being up until that time could make, which is between, if you like, something which is religious as opposed to something which is secular. I mean, previously to this in Europe, I mean, monarchs ruled by the divine right of God. The political world was the religious world. And of course, in the Islamic world, in the Confucian world, everywhere else we look, basically everything was infused by what we might call sort of like a religious worldview. So yes, I mean, coming to understand if like how religion and secular are set up as two distinct spheres. And of course, there's a particular sort of Protestant, Christian, Western sort of background to this is incredibly important. As I said, you know, it would take at least another hour to try and sort of unpack all of that in sort of in detail. But yes, it's essential. Now, given I said that the secular comes from a particular place, a particular time, there's colonial baggage behind it, but of course it's been enforced on the rest of the world as well. Despite this, I think the secular remains incredibly important because what, if like at its best, I mean, there are obviously many different forms of secularism that can be put into practice in all sorts of different ways. It basically sort of provides, if you like, a neutral sort of ground where no particular sort of ethnic group, tribal group, religious group is favoured sort of by the government. They're not given that power. And of course, the one thing we know about power, it corrupts people. And whenever sort of like religion, ethnicity, particularly religious ethnic groups get into power, this leads to trouble in all sorts of places. And around Southeast Asia, we see this happening. So yes, if you like, this secular place provides this basis in which a dialogue can take place. Now, having sort of said this, again, religion and atheism, okay, they're not opposites in various ways. They can only be opposites if you exist in this worldview where these two things are sort of separate. They're forms of worldviews, of ideologies, of practices, of human meaning making. And in a sense, basically, all we're looking at is different forms of human meaning making. And actually, Ninian Smart is useful here because he used to like talk about worldviews. So in some of his books, he didn't just talk about religions, but it's like of humanism, of Marxism, of nationalism. All of these are simply different worldviews. And so when I talk about inter-worldview dialogue, I mean, Ninian Smart is part of like a background. I mean, there are all sorts of problems from Ninian Smart's work academically, but he's also part of a background to this. So there's many, many places where, you know, people can meet on this. I mean, to note some of them where there's crossover, again, I feel like sort of ethical issues concerned with the environment. It doesn't matter what your religious or non-religious background is, you've got that concern. Again, even for the forms of sort of prayer and meditation, which may seem more distinctly religious, but particularly globally now, we're called sort of mindfulness practice. And mindfulness, I mean, while it's like derived primarily like from Buddhist forms of meditation, it's something that, you know, sold in sort of in education institutions, done in hospitals as a secular form of practice. And of course, often by atheists, people who are teaching mindfulness. So if you like, there is a form of, if you like, atheist prayer out there, if we wanted to call it that. So again, there's all sorts of ways that these groups could come and meet and discuss these issues. On to your second point, crucial dialogues in Southeast Asia. Of course, Southeast Asia is not a united place. Again, I have to admit the British colonial background here. It's the British back in the 19th century decided that Southeast Asia existed, and of course the Americans have made it a more potent sort of term to cover, well, basically not just like the global seaways around here, but the mainland as well. So very different sort of contexts. But some key issues locally, one of them, of course, is the Buddhist-Muslim dialogue. There's, of course, in places like sort of Myanmar and Thailand, this is an issue, which, of course, is in other parts of the globe is not quite so pressing, particularly in Southeast Asia. This Buddhist-Muslim dialogue comes to the foreground. Also, the connection of religion and ethnicity, and I discussed this earlier. There's, of course, particularly in this part of the world, religious identities and ethnic identities get tied together in all sorts of ways. And so any sort of interreligious dialogue here has to be sort of an inter-ethnic as well as an interreligious dialogue to sort of help break down some of the baggage that goes around this. I also think sort of questions of social cohesion, and this is something that is much more a global sort of issue, that basically how people of different worldviews can get along is incredibly important in this, something Singapore has been working on very heavily the last few years within this. But also I'd pick up again these terms Islamophobia and atheophobia in particular. And of course, I'm not so much sure about some in Indonesia, but I know in Malaysia, atheism or atheists have an incredibly hard time there. So this understanding of sort of what atheism is incredibly important, but also, I mean, here, and of course, many other parts of the world as well. And this includes, I mean, also what we might typically call sort of the Western world. Some years back, I had an American student who came and studied with me in the UK. And he came into one of my courses on sort of an introduction to sort of religious traditions. And at the end of it, he sort of told me that he was an atheist. I said, I can tell you because I feel safe, because I can't go back and tell my family. And he basically sort of came from sort of part like that, sort of the mid sort of west of America, and said like my family would disown me if I told them I was an atheist. So this sort of prejudice against atheism again is a very wide thing. But also, as I've mentioned in my talk, again, this prejudice against sort of Islam. Now, of course, quite a few countries in Southeast Asia are Muslim majority societies, but not all of them are. But also, again, there's a lot of sort of perhaps skepticism in there, and also I think sort of forms of internal Islamophobia within Islamic sort of traditions where different parts are sort of not at war with each other, but there's a lot of sort of difficulties there. So I'd say those are four key issues. Of course, I'm an outsider. I've only been in Singapore for 6 years. I don't know Southeast Asia as well as some other people, but these are some of my thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. There's a question from Krishna Yogi in the chat. You can, I hope you can read it, but I'll also read it for people who are not in the Zoom but watching the YouTube. So this is the question. As far as I can observe, the stereotypes between religious and non-religious people are not quite visible in their interaction on a daily basis. People from different parties can still work in the same office or be in the same organizations where they can have a casual discussion about each other's views. The main problem is that stereotypes are perpetuated by institutions and figures, both from religious and non-religious, through writing and speech. How to deal with this issue? Yogi is a student at CRCS who is actually now doing a research on religious nuns in Indonesia. So if you're interested to know more, you can also ask questions to him.
Right. Okay. That sounds fantastic. I said I'd really like to know more about that particular group. Yeah, I mean, stereotypes are more complicated than we might think in various ways. And yes, I said to some extent on a day-to-day basis, they don't interfere in how people get on with each other. They can get by with each other. But if you like, the global and historical experience of sort of anti-Semitism, I think is quite telling here. So perhaps if this was in 1920s in Germany we were speaking, lots of stereotypes about the Jew as a type. And yes, they would be in offices, they would work alongside other people, you would go to the shops where they were, you would have these daily experiences. But of course, we know from our experience that, if you like, the prevalence of those through society could lead into what became sort of the Nazi sort of regime, sort of the Holocaust, the Shoah, and the attempted extermination of that particular group. And of course, you can be perfectly nice to people who've got very negative stereotypes around with. You want something from that person. You have to get around on a pragmatic basis. It doesn't actually make you like those people. So I wouldn't just say it's institutions or particular figures. If you like, stereotypes, they become part of a sort of a cultural background around us. Again, I could say more about this, and if I can do my second bit of advertising for the talk, again, the other book, The Religious Hatred, it's all about prejudice, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and chapter 1 all around prejudice theory within this. So they're extremely sort of hard to deal with in various ways. You need like a whole of society approach to really try and sort of weed these out. And again, back to sort of anti-Semitism, as we've seen sort of in Europe, I mean, to some extent, you know, before the World War II, the aftermath of that had done away with sort of anti-Semitism, but it's now back in a huge scale. I mean, across Europe, in Germany, France, I mean, elsewhere. I mean, obviously parts of some movements, particularly parts of the far right, to use that, are now trying to distance themselves from it, because it's still in some ways is more socially problematic, but it's still clearly there in parts of the far right. And even those who are distancing themselves from it, many of them are probably still actually anti-Semitic. It's just good PR not to appear to have that. So, yeah, what to do about it? I said, I mean, a whole of society approach is needed, because through the schools and the education system, this is needed. The media has to be on message. You need the politicians on message. And of course, now social media platforms, it's a lot harder to deal with. But of course, on an individual basis, there's ways we can deal with this. And of course, part of this is affecting the fact that we're all prejudiced. We can't escape that fact. It's part of being human. You know, to make sense of our world, you know, every day, like there's millions of bits of data sort of coming in. So we put things into boxes. And these boxes, particularly when we think about other people, are basically stereotypes. And to some extent, you know, some of these are relatively sort of, you know, benign in terms of sort of how I think. You know, a student comes into my office, I don't have to stop and think, oh, is this a student or a staff member? You know, and there's a student box. And hopefully we don't have prejudices about our students, or not too much. But, you know, we have boxes we put people into, and this is basically the process through which stereotypes and prejudices arise, the fact that we have to sort of simplify our world because it is so complex. So, yeah, I said they're there, they are prevalent throughout our societies, and of course, even if we don't buy into them, they're there in our background sort of minds. We all know these stereotypes, and particularly in times of like sort of fraught situations under sort of fear or threat, you know, these can come more readily to our mind. And even if we don't consider ourselves as prejudiced, you know, we may act upon them. You know, if for several hundred years my social group is regarded another social group as less trustworthy, if I'm in any position of doubt, you know, I might err on the side of sort of acting on that particular sort of stereotype. So we need, again, to educate ourselves to be aware that we have these prejudices and the capacity to be prejudiced within ourselves, to personally sort of work through it and think through the problems within this. Now, I said there's certainly a lot more that could sort of be said about this within that, but hopefully that cuts to some of the key points. I'm not sure if it might be appropriate if we've got time, that I don't know what the stereotypes of like nuns or non-religious are in Indonesia, and maybe you could say something about that, Krishna.
Yeah, well, we're running out of time now.
Oh, okay.
But well, if you can comment just quickly, this is related to your last statements, I guess. What do you think? What do you think is the incentive for religious people to be involved in dialogue with atheists, especially in a place like Indonesia, in which religion dominates? The atmosphere is more religious. Why should there be a dialogue with atheists?
Right. I mean, to some extent, this question could be asked in any majority-minority situation. Why should the majority talk to the minority? So, I mean, whether it's, I don't know, Muslims and Buddhists, Christians and Jews, atheists and religious people, the same logic applies. You can only sort of overcome problems and misunderstanding by talking to people. That's sort of, if you like, sort of the way into this. And yes, they may be a relatively sort of small group in here, but that doesn't mean to say that they are not sort of prejudiced against, they don't have problems in sort of society. And also globally, while the data seems to suggest that actually the proportion of religious people in the world will rise over the next few decades, which is partly because those who identify with religion reproduce more quickly than those who identify with atheism. We know that I said atheist worldviews are rising. They're most predominant amongst sort of the younger sort of generations. So, I mean, this is looking towards the future. If you want to sort of understand sort of where this is coming from, it will help. And also, of course, to speak to somebody you disagree with or sees from the world from a different point of view helps you understand yourself better. And this is one key part of dialogue. It's not just for the other person's benefit, it's for your benefit as well. It's an existential good for yourself to talk to those people who are different from you.
Okay, well, very interesting. And I think that that's a very fitting closing to our discussion today, the importance of dialogue. So even if you have more power or you dominate, you are more dominant, but involved in dialogue helps you to understand yourself better, actually. And that's the reason for all types of dialogue. So thank you very much, Paul, for very interesting, very engaging discussion today. And I hope this is the first in the Wednesday forum, but it will not be the last. I hope there'll be other opportunities for us to have discussions online or offline. Sure. And also, I'd like to say that this Wednesday forum actually is the last Wednesday forum in this semester. We are close to Idul Fitri holiday, close to the end of the semester. Next week is the end of the semester. So yeah, I'm also happy that I think this semester we have had 10 weekly discussions. So we'll see you again next semester. And well, actually, I would like Aziz, the host of Wednesday Forum, if you can come out with your camera, Aziz. Aziz have been taking care of Wednesday Forum in the past few years, managing many things in Wednesday Forum. And this may be his last Wednesday Forum as the manager, because he's going to the US for his PhD very soon. So we should thank Aziz for organizing this Wednesday Forum for many years, producing good posters and others. So thank you very much, Aziz. I think you leave a good legacy on Wednesday Forum.
Thank you,
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's all, everyone. Again, thank you very much, Paul. And we'll see you again, and also everyone in this forum sometimes soon, next semester, I hope. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Again, thank